they're saying.
Well, when we talk about maritime law and admiralty law, we're basically talking about the same thing. Now, sometimes people split those up and they want to talk about maritime law as being like dry law. In other words, what affects the carrying of people or goods on the water, whereas your wet law, admiralty law, might have to do with salvage and collisions and ship arrest. In other words, where they actually arrest the ship.
Can I even butt in real quick?
Oh, yeah, please do.
Is the admiralty law, because you're outside that 9 miles, it's international stuff, where there's got to be some agreement between countries that there's a standardized law out there?
That's right. You know, back in the 1900s, when the steam engine came into effect, suddenly the earth became a lot smaller, and it became important for people to join together. And we saw World War II shaping up, World War I shaping up. So there were a lot of alliances, and the carrying of goods and docking of boats in foreign countries became more common. So yeah, there was a lot of treaties that occurred. For instance, one treaty that we're operating under now has 167 countries have signed on to it to allow the uniformity of law. So yes, treaties are a really important part of this.
I see how that would be extremely important to do, but it's just interesting how it's going to be different as compared to on the land. So let's get into this.
Well, when we talk about the land, we're talking about common law, and common law, of course, is something that is affected by precedent. The admiralty law, on the other hand, has a history going back before the United States was even thought about, before Columbus even sailed the seven seas. Back when Byzantine sailors and Roman sailors were out on the ocean, they were also on the ocean with the Chinese and with Muslim people. So the laws had to be, it had to be somehow historically written, so there was some reliance on it. And for instance, Byzantine and Roman law typically had the seafarers being paid some sort of percentage. Sort of like me as a personal injury trial lawyer gets paid. I get a percentage generally. So at the end of the shipping, whenever there were goods delivered and there was some profit to the company, the money was split up in accordance to rank. In other words, if you were a captain, you would get a whole lot more than if you were a deck swabber. But on Muslim law, you were paid in advance. You were paid with the understanding that if for some reason you deserted or something else occurred, the trip was cut short, that you would owe the money back. And of course, this was done to take care of the family while you were gone. Whereas the other law tended to attract seafarers who didn't have families, who were a little bit more wild. The Muslim folks, they wanted their people to be more family oriented. And that's sort of why the law was a little bit different there. So you get then this meshing of these laws into today, where we have a more uniform law that not only affects the United States, but will affect Britain, France, and some Chinese countries. So it's Asian countries and so forth.
Is admiral law born of common law?
No, absolutely
let me
not.
clarify my question, though, just so you know what I'm saying. If before they go out to sea, they're on land deciding, we need to do certain things when we're out on sea. Although the sea laws may be different, they derived it on land, didn't they?
Well, it's kind of the opposite. The laws really started out more in admiralty than they did common law. And so the common law our common law came from the British system. But before our common law was developed, British also had an admiralty law. And you remember the Boston Tea Party that we talk about a lot. That happened because of something called the Stamp Act. And what we have is this admiralty law business is a very special niche in the law. If I'm ever involved in an admiralty case, which I have been, I have someone sitting with me who is an admiralty lawyer. Some of the people who used to be admiralty lawyers would be Hamilton. We know him from one of our founding fathers, Madison. And these guys were really into it, and they knew what they were doing. So the Stamp Act was being broken, if you may, not followed. And of course, it had to do with sending tax money over to England. But here in America, where we have trial by jury, because of Madison, because of Hamilton, they had trial by jury. It was unlikely that anybody who didn't abide by the Stamp Act would be found guilty. So the British decided, hey, we're going to fix that. We're going to put it under Admiralty law. So then the Crown gets to decide who's guilty or not. And that's when our Constitution was being developed. And that's when these fellows said, you know, we got to have trial by jury. Thus the 7th Amendment of the Constitution was born. That gives us the right to a trial by jury, not by the Crown.
It's amazing, the history, man. It really is.
It all meshes together.
There used to be this show, and it's called Connections. You wonder why you're dealing with an object today. It's because you go back in history and you see how one thing leads to the other, just like you're saying now.
Absolutely. Yeah, and let's not get confused about this history as it relates to the law of the sea. The law of the sea is an international treaty that I talked about a little while ago, where we have these European unions and all the nations. It really has to do with mineral laws like the oil and the gas. I mean, you have the Horizon oil well offshore a couple of 100 miles. Well, that's being done because of international law and because of the law of the sea. So, yeah, the history of all that is interesting. It's something that we really don't know a whole lot about, because here in Milam County, we don't have a lot of interstate or international shipping being done. We don't have bodies of water that are affected by international or interstate
Interstate
shipping.
is between states, right?
Correct. Oh, yeah.
Interstate would be internally.
And you remember we had a show not too long ago where we talked about how interstate commerce
Yes.
doesn't necessarily mean that it has to cross a state line. Like the corn being fed to pigs was the example.
Right. Yeah.
So it can still be interstate even though it doesn't appear to be. Anyway, so back in the 1900s, we started having all this shipping and development of the law, and we decided then that we needed to have these treaties. And one of the reasons we had this development is bird poop.
Bird poop?
Bird poop. So we have a farming going on, and after you farm land for 4 or 5 years and you don't have commercial fertilizer, which they didn't back in the 1800s, you need to fertilize it. And they found out that if you mined bird poop off the islands of South America and packed it into big ships, you could bring it over to the European Union or up here to the tobacco farms and spread it out, and it would triple and quadruple your yield. And that stuff was worth about $5 a bushel back then. So it was a big business to ship bird poop. So
I'm always interested in what the person's doing to figure that out. You know, is he in a closet somewhere thinking, bird poop, fertilizer, figure it out, man.
yeah, so you had the shipping and the mining, the processing of bird poop and bat poop, and it was a big deal. So that's one of the reasons that international law started to develop. It wasn't, we don't normally think of that as being a big commodity, but there were a lot of boats full of that stuff.
Is there, before we go any further, is there any way that you will be able to identify how this Admiralty law comes into effect into the common law for you and I, the regular Joe and Jane?
Well, they are separate, and there are separate courts, and it is separate in our Constitution. So, you know, there's I can contrast them, but
Well, don't let me steal your thunder. I was just curious if in the course of the segment it will come across. If
Yeah.
it does, I'll wait.
well, sure, okay. For instance, if you get hurt on a cruise ship, you are going to be bound by your ticket, and the ticket is like an arbitration clause. And of course, the Texas they kind of have seemingly lost the gist of the 7th Amendment, in that they have allowed arbitration clause to become the law of our state. But the arbitration clause internationally in a cruise ship requires you to give notice of your injury within 6 months and then file litigation within 1 year. Generally in Texas you have 2 years, and in other states like North Dakota, for instance, you have 6 years. Missouri maybe 3 years. So their statute of limitations are different in common law, but in international law, they're pretty much the same. And so we talk about the care of the passengers, and you know, passengers would bear the burden in a cruise ship injury of proving negligence. In other words, they would have to prove that the cruise ship did something wrong, that they were not careful, and that being not careful caused their injury. And that would also include something wrong with the ship, some sort of a, you know, like carpet being loose and them knowing about it. So there's a whole lot of law in common law that's the same as that, as far as proving negligence and proving that someone else messed up. That's what I always, you know, we use these fancy words, negligence, causation, and liability. And really, it just amounts to, did someone else mess up? Did they do something they shouldn't have done, or did they not do something they should have done?
But there's a difference on that too, in the sense of they knew it was bad, but they failed to do it, or they should have done something, but in reality they didn't know they were doing something wrong, but it's still their responsibility. Isn't there a difference between those two?
Yeah. One of them has to do with what we call gross negligence in the law, and it just is a wanton disregard. In other words, I know there's some hole out there, but I'm not going to tell anybody about it, and I'm going to just have fun watching them fall off in.
Okay, all right.
In law school, they talk about someone cleaning slate shingles off of a roof, and if you throw the slate shingle back into the alley, and someone happens to be back there, you know, there's usually nobody back there, but if they do, then that's negligence. But if you throw it off in the street and hit somebody, that's just willful wanton disregard.
Yeah. Interesting.
So in maritime law, also you have effects of liens. In other words, you know, these ships aren't built by somebody walking up and opening up their wallet and writing a check. There's going to be a lot of people involved in the building of a ship as far as financing it. So that's an important part of maritime law is how to build these ships and how to enforce the liens so that people are interested in the commerce of building ships. And of course, this is all handled by federal law. So like for instance, if we had a maritime case here in Milam County, it would go to Waco to the federal court.
This is so complex, man. It really is.
Well, that's why it's a niche, and that's why if you're an attorney and you have one of these cases in your office and you don't contact someone who is a specialist, then you're messing up.
So, but you know your stuff, and part of the stuff that you know is you may not be an expert in this field. I need to get somebody who's an expert in that field because somehow, some way, it all connects. It's almost like a chain of command. Something happens here, everybody's got to know. Something happens in maritime, I don't even know what I'm saying.
Well, it's sort of like if you, or an emergency room doctor, if you're an emergency room doctor as a physician, you have the right, the ability, and the passage to go ahead and set bones and do operations, and you can operate on the heart, you can operate on the brain, but certainly you wouldn't do that because you're not a specialist. And there are people who specialize and only do brain surgeries and only do orthopedic surgery. And it would be well advised to have them because not only are they specialists and they do this all the time, but they have the equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So maritime lawyers that I know are based in Hawaii. In Hawaii, in Miami, and in Boston. And you know, for example, a lot of the cruise ship contracts that you sign when you buy a ticket require you to either sue in Seattle or in Miami. So that's why some of these fellows are located where they are, or rather they're located there and that's their specialty.
So when you go on a cruise ship, as an example, are you giving up anything right-wise, protection-wise, from where you are from?
Oh yeah. You are going to be governed by the law of the flag that's on the cruise ship. Now, the only time you've ever seen a United States flag on a cruise ship is if you did the little cruise over in Hawaii where the ship just goes around to each island. Otherwise, they want their flag to be somewhere else. And of course, there has to be some substance to that. In other words, you can't just put a flag up and say, well, this is a Somalian ship.
Okay, you lost me on that one. So if you got like a Princess Cruise, is that a cruise line?
Yeah, Norwegian, I think. I'm not sure, but I think Princess flies a Norway flag.
Okay, so it doesn't matter. So if the company's owned by a certain person, that flag is going to be up on that ship, and you are under its laws.
Correct. Yeah, it's maritime laws. Which, if there's a big treaty, you know, they might be the same as a lot of other countries, but there are going to be some nuances.
Okay, so when you're going out there on your cruise, because I know a lot of people go on a cruise, and I'm wondering if they even think about this. Not that they're going to be doing something wrong, but God forbid something does happen and you are subject to the laws because you're involved with an incident. It'd be nice to know, hey, it's a little different in this country than it is here. And I think what I gathered, unless I misheard you, is that basically they're the same. The terms of when you can do things and how much time is allotted may be different with maritime law as compared to common law.
Oh, absolutely. And this, again, is why you want to make sure you get the right lawyer. And I spend a lot of time in my National Trial Lawyers Association meeting people and networking. So this is one of the things I like to do is learn about different kinds of law, just enough where I know what to do with those type of cases, as opposed to try to handle them out of my office, which would be ridiculous in maritime or admiralty law.
Does maritime or admiralty law have anything to do with rivers, lakes, streams within, let's say, this country?
Absolutely. I mean, anything that has to do with water that connects with an opportunity to move from one state to another. I mean, there may be lakes like Lake Powell that goes through, I think, Arizona and Utah and maybe into Colorado. That might be subject to maritime law.
What about Lake Travis?
I think that's all in Texas. And there may be some nuances. Again, if I went and talked to a maritime lawyer,
It's like the LCRA has their own laws, man, their own force, everything. It seems different if you're on that water or any type of LCRA treated or protected waters. It seems like it's different and they have more power than anybody else once you step on land.
well, it is their water, as they claim.
They claim, yeah.
They can't take away our constitutional rights, Matt, but they can sure put a bulge in the side of that balloon.
This is interesting. Okay, what else you got here?
Well, okay, let's talk about salvage. Salvage is always something that people are interested in because, it has to do with gold and silver and shiny things like that. So if we're out there and you're walking on the beach and
I never thought about this. Go ahead.
if you're in the Redneck Riviera and you're walking down the beach there in Gulf Shores and you look down and, man, there's about 4 big old gold bars and you pick them, and what would you think? Would you
Finders keepers.
finders keepers, losers weepers?
I wouldn't turn it in the way it is. I'd be cutting that thing up into pieces or something.
That's happened, and of course there's been some criminal activity involved in that sort of thing, but
I was just saying it.
I know. But anyway, you'd be half right because I know that there's already been some weeping going on when somebody loses a bunch of gold like that. But there is still some ownership retained in those gold bars. And if that ownership can be established, the ownership might be the country of Spain or Italy or France because it might have been lost back in the 1500s. You never know. But the good news is the admiralty law and the maritime law helps you out with regard to salvage rights. And salvage rights would be a question of law. And there are a lot of things that help determine the salvage rights. For instance, if you can imagine there's a big ship that's being blown into a reef and you are in another ship and you risk your ship and your crew and your equipment to cable that thing off and pull it away, that your salvage rights might be bigger than if that same ship was just lost power out in the middle of the Mediterranean and you hooked onto it and brought it safely into port, because bigger risk, bigger rewards, I guess is one way of putting it. So it really has to do with opportunities and quick thinking. There are situations where if a ship sinks, that's what they call a high-risk situation where you are bringing a ship up. So they got the high order and the low order of salvage. The low order would be like the ship running out of fuel and you giving it some fuel. So they owe you for that, and the ship actually does.
Rick, let me ask you something. Let's flip back over to LTC. Let's say you're saying the ship's going to the reef and another ship's helping them and they get some salvage rights because they put more risk into it. What about third-person protection of another person? and let's say the person who you're protecting gets some type of benefit from the incident, you went and stepped in to try and help them, do you get any financial benefit off of that?
Well, under maritime law, you would for property. There is no salvage value for life or limb. In other words, you should always help people. But if you're going to risk your equipment to help someone else's property protected, then you should have some salvage rights.
I see that. Okay.
Yeah. Now, you know, like for instance, if a ship is on fire and your crew boards it and puts the fire out, if the ship is already sunk and you bring it up, or if you are towing it away from the surf, that would be the howard or the lower, or it would be something more like pulling it out or giving it some fuel or pulling it off a sandbar. And, you know, again, it has to do with the skills of the saver. You know, some people are professional salvage operators. And things of value, and when I talk about things of value, I use the gold. That's a good example. But also you have like German U-boats that have a lot of good paraphernalia in them. Mm-hmm. Some of the American Civil War ships are high value. Sunken merchant ships might have high value stuff in them. So it has to do with the value of what you save. Now, you know, obviously if you go out and pull a 12-foot sailboat off a reef, you're not going to expect as much as if it were a 70-foot merchant ship.
Rick, we got somebody calling. Let's see if it has something to do or pertains to this. We'll see it unless they want to do a trade radio.
I guess we'll find out.
Maybe they want to talk about piracy.
This is Matt. You're on the High Cap Adventure Radio program. How can I help you?
Hey, Matt. I've got a question about my firearm, but it's not related to what y'all are talking about right now.
That's fine. Go ahead. What you got?
Well, I got an EMP shield. It's Dawn, by the way. I don't like the trigger that's on it. I want to put an Apex trigger on it. Now, if I'm in an altercation, this is my everyday carry weapon. Is that going to cause legal issues for me due to modifying the gun?
You know, I've heard questions like that, like if you use different types of ammo, self-defense ammo as compared to basic ammo. And we're fortunate, Rick, if you want to, jump in on this, that'd be good. The answer I would give to you is, I don't know. You get a good attorney who wants to cause a fuss, they could probably do something. And then you have a great attorney like Super Attorney Rick Dodd here saying, no, you're crazy, whatever, and he'll probably help you get off the situation. But Rick, what's your input on that?
About modifying a gun?
Modifying a gun, better trigger.
The only, I mean, that's your business to modify the trigger. If you're waving it around, pointing at somebody and it goes off, you would probably be negligent anyway.
See, I look at it this way. I say, no, I'm modifying the trigger because the original trigger was rough and it would cause my gun to jump and not be extremely accurate. Whereas the new trigger, being more slick and smooth, enhances and makes more sure of my accurate shot.
Well, just don't point the thing at anybody. Unless you intend to, and then let it go.
I don't think you got much to worry about, buddy. Really.
I don't either.
Just maintain proper gun safety, and you'll be all right.
Yeah, and if as long as you maintain something and operate it reasonably, and as far as modifying it, if your modification and you feel safe with it and it is safe, I think
what if I put mercury in hollow tip bullets and covered it with wax? Would I get in trouble for that?
Well, you might be developing a bullet that would be illegal.
Okay. All right. I hope we answered the question. Thanks for the call. If somebody else got a question, feel free to give us a call, 254-697-6633.
About how much more time do I have?
Probably got 5 minutes.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Jones Act, because that is something that is developed under the Maritime Law. It was developed in the early 1900s by a gentleman. Guess what his last name was?
Smith.
Okay, close. his cousin, Mr. Jones, Wesley Jones, out of Washington State, and of course, like a lot of pork barrel congressional information, Senator Jones from Washington had the Jones Act enacted because it has to do with interstate commerce, interstate movement of goods between states. And it requires interstate commerce to be done with ships that are built in America and manned by Americans, which sounds great for Americans, except that Puerto Rico, for instance, the Jones Act has been blamed for the decline of the economy in Puerto Rico. One study indicates that shipping goods to Puerto Rico by America costs twice as much because of the Jones Act. So, of course, we have proponents of the Jones Act and we have opponents of the Jones Act. And you can imagine folks in Oklahoma who have to pay more for their goods probably don't like the Jones Act,
Right.
where the folks in Washington, because of the Jones Act, have pretty much a monopoly on trading with Alaska, like it a whole lot. So Texas probably likes it pretty well. We have a lot of industry and economy and commerce from ports here in Texas. So that is one of the things about the Jones Act, and it allows a protection of the sailors. So this is one thing where I sometimes get involved is people who get injured on the high seas. The Jones Act allows them to have a claim under negligence, which common law is generally workers' compensation laws. If you get hurt on the job in Texas, your rights are very limited, but all you have to do is prove that you were hurt. Whereas the Jones Act, if you can prove negligence or that the ship itself had a problem that caused your injuries, you can get compensation for a wide variety of things, non-economic damages and economic damages. Whereas if you cannot prove negligence, you're pretty much down to like workers' compensation benefits of some money weekly while you are off work until you reach maximum medical improvement, and also your medical is paid for. So the Jones Act is important, and there's a big long history of it that we could talk about for hours, and there are books like a full library that might tell us a little bit more about the Jones Act and all of its
I'll tell you
nuances.
what, Rick, since time's running out, I may be throwing this on you and you're not prepared for it, and if so, that's cool. But I mentioned just before the segment started how terminology, you take off the maritime and admiralty law that can be recognized here on land. Like we were talking about the dock, ships comes into the dock. The truck is loading up on the dock because they're shipping goods. Is there anything else that you can think of that terminology of the sea comes to a common usage here on land? I had a bunch of them. I just can't remember. I thought you might be familiar with them.
Well, I think what we're talking about there is international law and international commerce. Because whenever you have a ship come in from Saudi Arabia into the port in Corpus Christi, there's going to be people on that boat that are not Americans, and there's going to be rules at the dock that require them to stay on the ship, or if they come off the ship, of course, they have to have their passports and get stamped in for visas. So that's important. And so when goods pass back and forth, now we have tariffs in place that we have to account for how many pounds of steel might be going in or coming out. We're going to have those windmills that we see popping up all over Texas. Those things are coming in from countries like Belgium and Sweden. They're going to be weighed and tariffed. So we have cotton grain going out. All that stuff just has to be accounted for, I think, is my point.
It's very in-depth, interesting, and I found it very interesting because I've always touched on maritime and admiralty law through the course of my studies on how things go in the world, but I'm not a master at it. I know it's out there, and I know there's a difference. So it's just an interesting thing to me, and I thought we'd express it and talk about it today, which you did, and I think you did a great job. And like you said, it could be 2, 3, 4, 5 hours worth of information to talk about.
It would be more than that if you
More
really
than-
got down to it. I mean, one more point. A lot of people would recognize if you got hurt while you're working on a tugboat that the Jones Act would affect you, but a lot of people wouldn't think about fishermen, commercial fishermen. If you're out, commercial fisheries for, say, red snapper, and you might be in a small boat, like 4 or 5 people, the Jones Act would still apply. It doesn't have to be a big old merchant ship, in other words.
And what about the guys? I know you mentioned this before, the Verizon thing, but what about the guys who are working the oil rigs that aren't out in 200 miles of water? They're in.
Okay, oil rigs, even though they're fixed platforms, are also governed by the Jones Act. So that's a good point.
Okay. Well, very good.
Because they're seamen. And a seaman, there are certain definitions regarding a seaman. One of the things that is always a question of fact, and sometimes us lawyers get balled up in, is the definition of seaman insofar as a substantial amount of time on the water. And that is a question of fact. And there's been one federal court case that says at least 30% of your time is on the water. But again, that's just a case that gives us some guidance. It
Guidance,
doesn't
yeah.
mean that that is the line.
Okay, Rick, we're out of time. Why don't you tell everybody how they can get a hold of you?
Well, you can give us a call at 254-697-4965, or you can just get a little respect for you and go to respectforyou.com.
And Rick and the crew over there, Copley & Dodd Krebs Law Firm, they sponsor this segment of the program. Can't thank you enough for that. Without people like you and my other sponsors, we wouldn't be on the air. So make sure you contact these sponsors when you need some help, because they're helping us. Circle of Life, everybody.
You made a point earlier, Matt, about the time, and that's always a big problem in a law office, is the amount of time you spend in being able to say no. That's one of the reasons that I specialize in what I do, because if I had to learn all these different kinds of laws, I wouldn't be able to spend the time with my clients that I need to. And it's important that I do that. In order for me to represent somebody thoroughly, I have to spend the time on their case.
That's good. Well, that's why you're so successful. Your system works, so that's good. All right, let's. Rick, once again, thanks for coming on the show. Trey, let me talk about some announcements before we take a break. We'll run a few minutes late for the chief, and we'll have Janae right after my announcements here. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few dates coming up here. Just want to keep you reminded of. September 3rd, obviously, is Labor Day, so have fun on that as the summer closes down. September 7th, we've got our twofer night. That's Friday the 7th, September 7th. You come with somebody. The person, your guest, will shoot for free. Range time is free. September 8th, Saturday, 2 o'clock, is my next LTC class. It's filling up pretty quick, so if you're interested in that class, you need to give me a call or an email ASAP. It's $60 for a new person, $40 for somebody who just wants to take a refresher class. I don't have to do any extra paperwork on you. That's why it's a little bit cheaper. September 14th is our next round robin. If you haven't done one, you need to do it. It's not only fun, but it's great training for somebody, especially if you got a license to carry. September 21st, if you recognize yourself or identify as a woman, your range time is free on the third Fridays of the month. Seminars. We've got seminars for basically everything. Shotgun, rifle, pistol, self-defense, home invasion, so on and so forth. Go to aaronsgunshop.com. Check out the High Cap Adventure page and look at all the different types of seminars. You give me a group of 5 or more people, we'll set up a class date especially for you. Sponsors. We've got great sponsors now, but there's a lot of cost it takes to get a show like this on the air. So if you have a business and you think it fits with this type of show, we'd love to have you as a sponsor. You can give me a call or an email, and I can give you the details on how to become a sponsor for this show. All right, Trey, let's get that delicious Janae Goodman on here with another segment of Tactical Snacking, and I think she's going to be refreshing our minds about the basics when it comes to food and prepping. So take it away.
Greetings